like we did last week, we're going to spend some time reviewing the lessons in range of strength. So some of you are maybe going through them right now, which is good because then we can elaborate a little more on each individual lesson as you jump on the calls or go back and look. And then those of you that have taken the lessons already, you'll be able to reflect on what you have already learned. And maybe we can talk a little deeper around the lesson or, experiences you're having with the content you've learned or applied, that kind of thing. So it's going to be a little more interactive to that. So any questions throughout the lesson, just pop them in the chat box and we'll review at the end. And we'll save some time like we usually do for some Q&A and deeper discussion around the lesson itself and how it applies to the whole certification and course. So without any further ado, I will get started. Okay. So we're looking at range of strength certification lesson 2 this week. And lesson 2, we are exploring the agonist activations, specifically the end range work in agonist activations, how we apply those and use them, and why they're an effective tool for us as coaches. So in today's lesson, our objectives will be to define and review agonist and antagonist muscles. It's kind of like when you do get into coaching, it's like beating a dead horse when we review some of these basics, but always a good reminder. And specifically, we will talk about how they relate to stretching rather than the classic bicep curl, that's probably, I think, one of the only examples of agonist-antagonist muscles out there is like when the bicep contracts and shortens, and it's okay. There's a lot more to it and different exercises than the bicep curl, but we will then look to define in-range agonist activations, their purpose, the why, what they can do to help us, and why are we terming it this way, and just dive a little bit deeper into the whys behind it. We're going to discuss programming and application, and then review the practical application of it. For each lesson in the certification, there are practical components. So we will talk about the ones that are related specifically to this lesson, and then we will talk about the practical application beyond those standards that are applied to this lesson. So let's review agonist and antagonist muscle groups. So we can think of the agonist muscle group being the one responsible for generating the movement. Specifically, when we think about flexibility exercises, a good example would be how the hip flexors contract to lift the legs in a seated pike exercise. Okay, so the hip flexors in that exercise, in that movement, are responsible for generating the movement. And you can think about how that would apply to other exercises when you think about that. Antagonist muscle groups oppose this movement, and we would think of that muscle group as the muscle in the stretch, specifically as the muscle that is lengthened. So for the same example, the same exercise, the hamstrings lengthen and oppose the movement of the seated pike lift. Okay, so that would be a review of agonist and antagonist muscle groups, but our example here is to think more about how it applies to flexibility. So there is other movements where we could think about how this is happening, like the side split, for example. Okay, so in the side split, the antagonist would be the adductors opposing the movement and lengthening, and we would be thinking about our glutes and hips, TFL, taking the load and basically generating the movement, shortening. I like to think about that too, shortening and lengthening when separating the two and thinking about movements in general, specifically flexibility, what's shortening, what's lengthening here. And then you can really break down further how you're going to create some systemization around the exercise or the stretch. So end range agonist activations. Let's first start by defining what that is. So it is a method of contracting the agonist muscle group in a stretched position at a controlled end range. So that last piece is very important. So it's at a controlled end range. It is a form of active flexibility. So if you are familiar with your components of flexibility, active flexibility has static and dynamic components to it. End range agonist activations can be executed both as a static active flexibility drill and as a dynamic active flexibility drill. So the two differences there are that in static active execution, there is no repetitive movement. So the seated pike lift, for example, again, the legs lift and they are held. If we were to do a dynamic active flexibility protocol for that exercise, we would then look to do repetitions and or pulses are the other way we think about just like more of a dynamic movement. But we're separating from just generalizing this as active flexibility because it is different in that we are in a controlled end range. So we are trying to position the body in a controlled manner. If we were to leave it more generalized, we would think about standing, a standing leg lift where I'm standing and I'm just holding my leg out straight, or swinging and kicking the leg, which are examples of active flexibility, but there is no gap control there in ability. So we're trying to actually close the gap in ability, develop specific strength in a specific end range. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that is. Why do we want to do that? So like I said there, holds would be static, pulses and lifts, repetitively reps would be more dynamic active components of flexibility. So the purpose of end range agonist activations in our training and for helping others and coaching others in gaining more flexibility would be that it builds strength in the agonist muscles that are exhibiting a reduction in activity. So think about working with somebody, or even think about yourself in your own journey. Like I know for myself, when I started taking on the journey in flexibility, my muscles in certain positions, when they were agonist to the movement, weren't exhibiting any activity in certain ranges for a long time because I wasn't able to demonstrate that range of motion with strength. So in using and applying the end range agonist activations, we can rebuild the dormant muscles that haven't been used. So rather than like trying to force someone into a position that they can't express, we're going to break that down. So an example could be like an ass to grass squat. So someone can't ass to grass squat. We're going to try to get them to that point. And in doing so, we may choose end range agonist activation exercises that would provide hip flexion in a range that is above hip to knee level so that they start getting activity in those muscles in the ranges that we're trying to exhibit. So this is how we break things down further and build strength. We can start applying this component of flexibility training to get someone to build strength in areas and muscles in ranges that they have been very dormant in. So in doing so, we will increase motor control in a stretched position. You'll be able to articulate the end range of a stretch, so that mind-muscle connection. It is very, very common when people stretch that they have no idea how to contract opposing muscle groups, or it's not even a consideration. The focus always being on the muscle that's stretched. My hamstrings are tight. I'm going to do a bunch of hamstring stretches. When really, in reality, the other half of that is that they need to be working on hip flexor strength, abdominal strength, all of these other components, right? So this is be like how we start to present that and build off of those components. The end range agonist activations also serve as a contraction technique that can give you access to more range of motion. So, for example, we are doing body weight static stretches, and we introduce contract relax within that. So contract relax, when we're in a static stretch, it's going to be contracting against the stretch to shorten the muscles that are being stretched. And then we relax deeper. One of the other ways you can do this, instead of just relaxing deeper, is you can contract against the stretch, and then you can contract with the stretch and perform an agonist activation. So it serves the purpose of providing that extra component of contraction techniques in a stretch position. And in doing all of these things, we're mitigating risk of injury, building strength in positions where we haven't been active, and in muscles that haven't been active. I mean, that is a primary solution to mitigating the risk of injury. So let's talk about some different variables of programming. And this is open to your own interpretation and how you like to program and do these things. Like, I'm open to discuss this further as well after this lesson. But how I categorize it in range of strength is agonist activations in the end range I would put under the preparatory range category. So preparatory range is like our GPP for flexibility. We're performing more low-grade bodyweight static stretches and more low-grade strength training variables in an end range. So this would be very preparatory. That being said, it doesn't have to be subjective just to beginners. This should be addressed at all levels of ability. And quite often the case is, in my experience, that when someone does express a high level of flexibility, and for example, they're having issues, albeit that they are experiencing pain and or potentially on the verge of being injured and or maybe injured, or they've plateaued in their flexibility training, more oftentimes than not, this person hasn't taken the time to address end range agonist activation strength. And that a lot of times can be, I guess, the cure for them to get over those plateaus and or recover from pain or potential risk of injury. A good example of that may be the case of the dancer. The dancer is flexible. This is often the case where they can express passive range quite easily and express a great degree of movement, but there starts to become a point where they start to lack strength in these end ranges, and it would be in the agonist muscle groups. So it kind of puts them in these positions where it's like overuse injuries. They're not addressing the problem, and they kind of start going down that road of, you know, once upon a time I was a really good dancer and I got injured or whatever. So within programming, end range agonist activations couple very effectively with static stretches. So they work very well together in that, you know, the static stretch, we're laying down the tissue, we're creating change at a cellular level, we're making those connections, and then we're also able to strengthen the muscles that lay dormant and haven't had activity in those end ranges as well, like the agonist muscle groups. So they couple very, very nicely. with static stretches. And they help us address the structural strength imbalances at those end ranges. So that is often the case when someone is exhibiting a limitation in the shoulder. Maybe usually it's the case is that, your left hip and your right shoulder, not speaking from experience or anything, but you have these imbalances from one side to the other. And often the case is agonist muscle groups in an end range position from one side to the other are very weak. So we can use this component because it's also very controlled component of training. So we're not at risk at being in a position and trying to activate the muscle. Whereas, we're going to be continually at risk if we're just going to continue strength training and squatting and pressing and not actually taking time to address the imbalance specifically. So for prescription, that's a little bit how we would program it. And then within programming, how would we now prescribe agonist activation drills? So in doing so, I want you to think strength. So we are looking to strengthen through an end range, and our mind around that whole process should be strength. And when we think strength, we think about the 5 rep. Well, I think 6 rep is actually, the barbell strength prescription, 6 or under. But 5 is just a nice round number for me. Like it's easy to program, and you could probably do 6 if you wanted, but 5 reps is like a good solid foundation to build optimal strength levels with the end range agonist activations. Within that, the static hold is in a strength zone as well too. So that strength and power zone of 10 to 15 seconds is more optimal for end range agonist activations for what we want it to do. If we want it to be creative and I guess just go a bit harder on the exercise. We did talk about this last week when we went over that. We talked about being creative in our programming just for adding some spice to flexibility. I mean, we could add challenges to an end range agonist activation drill and push it to, a higher rep range and a higher static hold range. But specific prescription, this zone will do the job for us. This is the strength zone. If we are thinking about like holds per rep, 3 seconds is an optimal hold time. If we were doing a 5 by 3 second hold, we would be in that optimal 15-second total time of work. So the time under tension would be ideal. So that 3 second hold time is a pretty key zone to be in for if we're going to be doing holds. Pulses would be different. It's more just about the movement being, albeit dynamic and what have you. But that 3 second hold time, that's like a sweet spot. So let's look at some examples. And I'm going to provide you with 2 examples that I most commonly use that work really well. So first example would be the coupling of a body weight static stretch with an end range agonist activation. So your A1 is a hamstring stretch, so a static hamstring stretch. Whatever one you choose, could be like a single leg pike stretch, 30 seconds, followed immediately by the agonist activation to that. So the agonist activation to that would be seated pike lift. It doesn't have to be that. It could be like hip flexor variation. It could be standing single leg lift. But to make it more specific to end range agonist activations, we would prop the leg to a height where it was very specifically focused on at the end range of the movement that person could exhibit. So it's 5 reps with 3 second holds. And we could perform 3 rounds of that, for example. And that would be in an optimal work window with what we presented last week with body weight static stretches. Like breaking it down, it could be 30 seconds, 60 seconds, 2 minutes. You would think about sets and total time under tension, if that were the case. But this is my favorite way to do it. And this is, you would see this in the range of strength protocols. I really like to perform, I guess, like a circuit style approach to my flexibility work. I've had a lot of success with that, with people that integrate flexibility into their training. We see that in the range sprint as well. But this second example works really well also. So we create an A series of static stretches and follow that by a B series of end range agonist activations. So you can think again about if it's focused on the hips. So we're performing static stretches around the hips, looking to open up extension, looking to open up rotation. And then we would have a B series to complement that. That was more agonist strength specific. We will move into next week's lesson. We'll start talking about loading range of motion. So when we load it with weights and we start to strength train our range, then that's when we can be even more creative with prescription, and we can start thinking about the end range agonist activations couple really well with loaded mobility, loaded range exercises like Jefferson curls and dislocates, things like that. So there's more creativity there, but I'm giving you the example based off of right now what we did last week to this week. And this would be, again, lesson to lesson. I want you to build, right? So we're building off last week's lesson. I'm showing you really good preparatory range programming examples here. As we move into loaded flexibility work next week, we will build off of what we presented this week. Like, how do we build into adding this now? What couples nicely with it? How do we make it happen in a session and prescribe it so that we get results? So practical application in this course focuses on these two exercises. These two exercises for end range agonist activations are like the squat and the bench press for this component of flexibility training. It's they're big and effective and fundamental for a coach taking this course to be able to demonstrate. We can break this down, these movements down further, and that's what I would like to talk about more today, is just looking beyond these two movements. How would we regress and or progress these movements? And to find more agonist activation exercises, you can now refer to the exercise library I created that I have attached to the range of strength certification. There's about 100 exercises in there, categorized into preparatory strength and specific range of strength work. And you can explore those. They don't clearly say that they're agonist activations, not all of the ones that are, but after your lessons and learnings, you will be able to identify what ones are and start thinking more creatively about how you can create and modify and regress and progress these kind of movements. So that being said, I am going to stop my screen share now. And we're going to talk a little bit about those exercises and how, again, we can regress and progress those movements. So the protocol for passing certification, so the seated pike, it's specifically hands at the knees, hands flat on the ground. Okay. So trying to see Gavin, he can't talk right now because he's at work. Luke, you're familiar with the differences. Can you talk right now, man? So if you guys can talk right now, we can unmute and just get some conversation opened up.
What was the question? What we're looking for?
So we're going to focus on the seated pike lift right now, and first of all, just talking about the course standard. So have you explored that exercise, Vina, and used it and applied it?
Yeah. Yeah. Did you want someone to demonstrate? Is that what you're asking? Or
No, I just want to talk about the specifics of why we have it set up the way we do in the certification.
is that related to the Jefferson curl so that when you're doing it standing, you only get past your knees?
It is very helpful for the Jefferson curl because it's creating that hip flexor strength. We want to learn to flex the hips in the Jefferson curl and be able to create that awareness of the agonist muscles as we move through that end range. But there were a few people just put in the chat box too, is like there's differences. And with some of the other calls that we've done, we've talked about like standards and things like that. So we want to be able to show an exercise and show points of progression. And the seated pike lift, it is one of those exercises that it can be, I guess, abused a little bit. And so like people can just kind of take their own way of doing it. And the way it's been presented in the course is the most effective way to teach it to get the end result that we want with it, which is that agonist strength through the hip flexors and the compression strength through the abdominals. So it is quite a difference with one hands being flat. So what happens when people do the claw hand thing, when they do the seated pike lift, is they create a way for there being more space for them to lift the legs. It's a stronger hand position with the claw hand like being down, and it allows them to manipulate their upper body more to find a position where they can lift. So that's one thing we always want to look for when we're teaching that stretch, is like just little details like that. Like how are we coaching, the setup of the exercise? Yeah, it could be the same with handles, like the seated pike lift. There's a couple ways we can do it. So it is a bilateral lift. So the bilateral lift is double legs, both legs coming up. And our first step would be, we know that it gets harder as we move towards the knees or past the knees. The coaching standard is at the knees. That's what we've set for our coaches to say, like, yeah, we have to demonstrate it for 10 seconds at the knees. So our first troubleshooting would be making sure that the individual is getting comfortable with pressing their body down. So pressing their body down is allowing them to build a stronger position, but then getting them to move their hands. So moving the hands away from the knees would allow them to find that position that they can specifically do for themselves. But my favorite method for this that we can do is we can enforce the hip flexors to do the work by setting up the body closer to the wall, and by getting them to think about single leg versus double leg. So that's like our easiest way to break that exercise down, is to say, okay, we're going to lift one leg first and focus on the positioning. And we're also going to position ourselves against the wall so that we aren't going to totally overcompensate the lean back with the lower body and get the hip flexors doing the work. So with a lot of these agonist activation drills, think about modifying the body's positioning so that, hey, Francis, how's it going, man? You can make it as most effective as possible for the agonist muscle group that we're looking to target. Other ways we can break that one down. So we can move to standing. Okay, so we've presented that one in the course too. And standing, we could do a standing single leg lift, but to focus on the aspects of end range agonist activations, we would try to find a height where the user has to work the hardest. So we can't say for sure that it has to be hip height. Depends on, we have to measure the level of ability and what we're looking for. One good question that was asked, it was just a course discussion, I think it was right in the range of strength course, was like, how many degrees are we looking for? in the hips and the shoulders and things like that. There are clinical numbers that, like physical therapists, and when someone comes into a clinical setting, we look for this much degree of hip flexion and extension and rotation for it to be considered like normal and healthy. But for us, like we should know those numbers, and I shared those numbers in the course if you go to the discussion, but maybe I'll share them right on the range of strength channel. I'll write that down now because that actually it's useful information to know, especially within the shoulders and the hips. Like, what kind of degrees of range are we always looking for, or what's normal, so to speak? But I also don't want you to focus on the numbers either. And like, you're going to get a lot of people that come to you, and you don't want to necessarily have them focusing on getting to this degrees of motion and, thinking, oh, like I won't ever get past that, and like maybe like setting up to fail right away. It's that, counseling approach where we're going to work in the height that you can work in, and we're just going to have, the best technique that we can have in this height, and kind of progress from there. And then as, they start getting more comfortable, and then you can start moving towards numbers. Like, this is the degree of flexion we want to get to if we aren't there quite yet, or what have you. But yeah, there are degrees of motion that we look for in a clinical setting, that they look for that it's like a normal functioning hip. Those are good numbers to have, and they're quite easy to find. You could just Google search it, and it'll pop up if that's bugging you for whatever reason. So yeah, seated pike lift, that's the focus on the course for the course standard. But just talking about how we would break that exercise down even further, right? Have any of you coached that movement or experimented with it yourself? Free to share. Daniel, you've been using it, haven't you?
Yeah, I tried doing it.
Yeah, so
from hands beside the hips and moving it forward past the knees.
Yeah, you train handstands a lot. That's a very common exercise for hand balancers, trying to increase that compression strength for pressing and active flexibility strength for when you're upside down.
Yeah.
Have you coached it?
Not yet. I'm going to try it with one of my clients later on, student.
Nice. Good. So my first go-to, if they're struggling from the floor, wouldn't be to stand necessarily, would be to go back against the wall and try one leg at a time, building that strength up one leg at a time. That's a really good way to get them working hard. I mean, I like the standing agonist activation for the hip flexion, but seated it carries over so well, and you can, it's a single leg, and people enjoy it more. There tends to be way more enjoyment in that exercise, like setting it up that way as well. So that'll be good to share your experiences with that. Like, once you've done that, let me know how it goes. Yeah. So the other one we're talking about for the course specifically is the Y lift. So of the positions we look at for static stretches and agonist activations, we look at the ATYL positions, and Y being the hardest one of the shapes. We're looking for setup in that position and a 10-second lift. In demonstrating that, again, we can think about how we can break that down further. So that's a course standard for coaches to demonstrate. It's not super hard. Some people may struggle with it. Some people may struggle with, how do we make this exercise or movement challenging? And it does come more into, again, everything else that's happening around the shoulder. So how do we think about everything else that's happening around the shoulder so that we can focus on just the shoulder and the agonist activation there? So then we were thinking about, if you go watch the tutorial videos about the setup of the pelvis, okay, so when the back is collapsed, it's easier, it would be the same as doing it standing. If I arch my back, it's much easier for me to find more flexion in the shoulder. when we go to the ground and get people to have these positions in the setup for the arm lift, it's much harder for them to compensate. So when I'm standing on my feet. I can arch my low back. I can do these things that I'm unaware of. But when I'm lying down, I'm not standing. Now I can't use my legs, and it becomes a whole different ballgame. So we would be thinking about, again, that being a bilateral movement. We would be moving to a single joint lift. So we'd be looking at one arm lifts if we were to break that down further. Other effective ways to do the Y lift as well is to go from standing and hinge over a bench. So it's very similar to the standing hip flexion as well. So think about what we're looking to do here. We're looking to do a Y-shaped shoulder flexion. If I'm struggling on the floor, I want to create that agonist activation. I'm going to just bring the floor up higher. I'm going to have the arms on a bench, and I'm going to be looking to do the protocol from that position. We could move to standing against the wall, but as the higher and higher that we go, the less effective it becomes to making change at the end range. So I encourage you, if you haven't been using the end range agonist activations, to start incorporating them in your training. And that's part of the lessons with the courses as well. And the programming is that you're getting an opportunity to integrate it into your own training, troubleshoot how it works with you, as you should as coaches with every exercise that you do. So I would never prescribe something to someone that I haven't done, right? We talk about that a lot. You should experience it, troubleshoot how and why it feels good or it doesn't, troubleshoot how you will regress and progress those movements. Use the content, of course, that we've provided with the exercise library, the tutorials, and ask the questions. So I'm very keen and open to hearing how you use it. I mean, you may also have been coaching flexibility already for quite some time, but maybe haven't used this approach and integrated it within that with what you're doing now. So I'm keen to hear your experiences with it personally with clients. And also, if you're going to do it, if you want to chat before doing it with a client and just to review some things with me, that I'm open for that as well too. So have you guys gone through, we have some questions here. All right. Gavin was talking about compression strength. We were talking about the seated pike exercises is really good for building abdominal compression strength. And the compression strength is another topic for just talking about the trunk strength, but it is addressed with the seated pike lift. It's like an introduction to an L-sit exercise, like moving into those kind of static abdominal compression positions. And Gavin's used it for press handstand work as well too. So James, when you're talking about using handles for that seated pike lift, do you mean like actually doing like an L-sit from parallettes, or talking about being seated on the floor and doing it?
Yeah, I was referring to flat hands versus having the fingers spread out, and you're saying that it increases the height, so it increases the ability of the movement, takes away from doing it. I was saying, is that the same thing like using parallettes? Just a bit of brain fog, so I said handles. Yeah.
So what would happen is if I raised my hands, I would then have to compensate moving my body back, and then that would make it easier. Whereas what we could do also with this exercise is we could be seated on a low bench, I guess, if we had one, or maybe we could sit on a plate. Like imagine sitting on bumper plates, and then we push the hands to the ground and try to, so we would increase difficulty that way as well too. But the most effective way for that movement would be to move deeper into the stretch. So that would be an easy way to think about end range agonist activations, is to increase difficulty, just move deeper into the stretch. Okay, so same goes for the prone Y lift. I would move deeper into the stretch to make it more difficult. If I was doing another agonist activation drill, I would move, like the other one that we put in the course is like active couch stretch. So it's like your knee flexion activation. So think about being in couch stretch, but you're just coming off the wall. Yeah, if that got easy, or you want to make it more, you just move closer to the wall. We go deeper into the stretch kind of thing. So that would be the best way to think about challenging that movement. So Luke was asking if we can talk about rotation in the shoulder in the prone Y stretch. So internal versus external versus internal. So in the course, so we're teaching it in external rotation. So when we move into external rotation, we get more pec and bicep. And when we move into internal rotation, we're focusing more on the shoulder specifically, the shoulder range of motion and rotation. So that is actually presented, that was put in the library. So there is another movement in the library there. I don't know if you guys saw it, but it's the internal rotation lift. So it looks a lot like the Y, but the cueing is very different in that you're actually elevating your shoulders and internally rotating them and then contracting. And it's a really excellent exercise for teaching and moving into building strength for full rotation of the shoulder. So we do want to be working full rotation of the shoulder without pain. We don't want to be forcing it. The internal rotation agonist activation drills, they basically allow us to start thinking about, okay, now I'm in an end range. Can I even internally rotate my shoulder? If someone can't, and the cause for this too is that too many coaches introduce dislocates before measuring shoulder ability. Like, all right, do a few dislocates and get warmed up. It's like a really common approach. But if we want to look at that further, we would want to see if the shoulder even has the ability to actually contract in those positions, right? So the Y stretch specifically focuses on external rotation strength, but internal rotation lift off, agonist activation lift, focuses on your ability and your strength to actually internally rotate the shoulder and move with strength. So if you did want to, like as we get deeper into the lessons, we get into incline dislocates. It's one of the measurements of coach's strength. And it's probably one of the more challenging ones that everyone deals with, because I've been working with the coaches that are trying to hit that standard, and it's that they've never addressed rotation strength in their shoulder. And the incline dislocate, it's not like a dislocate. Like a standing dislocate, you can really move your body, but the incline dislocate moves you back into an incline. You can't use your trunk and your legs, and now you're solely dependent on your shoulder. And I've asked you to demonstrate 10% body weight as a demonstration. So now it's like you actually have to demonstrate that you can move strongly in that position. So a lot of the coaches I've helped move through that progression, it has been about now getting into internally rotated positions in an end range and building strength, introducing the windmill exercises, a traditional kettlebell windmill. You guys may be familiar with that introduces shoulder rotation. But yeah, it's a good question, Luke, because internal rotation right now is always looked at with a bent arm. Everyone's always looking at internal rotation, but we should be looking at internal rotation with a straight arm. So that would be like a big take home from that discussion, is like, are you looking at internal rotation with a straight arm versus a bent arm? Do you have the ability to rotate your shoulders before trying to rotate your shoulders? So yeah, Anna's asking about cars. That's another way to do it. Cars, if I was to use the cars, so what cars is the controlled articulated rotations. I would be looking at the end range application of it. So I would be looking at trying to control the range we're moving in. So if there's nothing here, I'm probably going to be like way out here, right? But if I start to stand next to a wall, I can now measure my ability to rotate with a block. And then there's something there that actually is providing me with feedback at where I can rotate the shoulder. To what degree? Maybe we would go back to look at those clinical numbers. To what degree of flexion and rotation do we want to be able to demonstrate? But I do like, if I do like any of the Carr's work, that is my favorite one, is the straight arm shoulder rotations. So fully all the way around with the wall. So it's one that we could look at deeper at some point, but you are on the right page there. I do like to do that one daily as well too. So Anna uses it in her warm-ups. And the only thing that I find a challenge with the Carrs is that if someone doesn't have the awareness of rotation, it becomes quite challenging for them to even rotate because they don't even know how that's supposed to happen. So a lot of us that have been in the field and stuff, and we're coaches and we train hard, we know how our shoulder should rotate. So if you do decide to use it, the only thing is that it can be very like the form can be very masked when someone's just kind of doing the shoulder rotation work. Whereas if we provide a stable apparatus like a dowel, and again, dowels are better than bands because bands aren't stable. So we're at my weakest point with a band, I'm going to start stretching the band. I'm not actually going to, so then I never know, there's no controlled mechanism of the movement. So that's why I do like the dowel so much more. So that internal rotation lift off with a dowel, it's providing a stable fixed point of where we're working strength. Whereas with the Carrs, it would be, I would have to use the wall, but then it's like, I'm still, I would want to make sure someone has a really good understanding of those fine end range points of external and internal rotation. So does anyone else use the shoulder Carrs? It's like a common.
I just want to ask, so if I get my client to go internal rotation, she would probably get like her traps overactivate and start cramping. And she's already got overactive traps.
Yeah.
So going in that wide position, I get her to do the external one and activate like that. But if I got her to do the internal rotation, I'm not sure if that's going to be. So how would I work around that?
So we first want to teach her to internally rotate with the shoulder set. So I mean that's commonly what we see with individuals that do have an overcompensating trap muscles, and they can't keep the shoulder set in place. So the upper back is weak, and it's compensating for something. So I would be working on developing her upper back posture kind of stability. So the ability to just have the shoulder set in place and then internally rotate. So for that one, the external rotation work with dumbbells does work quite well because it's very easy to keep the shoulder set and to find that fixed point where the shoulder is going to collapse out of position. So for her, we would be looking at building rotation strength with the shoulders set first. Whereas then we do want to build shoulder internal rotation strength with the shoulders out of position as well, because then we're going to get the pecs in the picture. And we don't want to avoid being out of the shoulder joint and in the scaps. Like we don't want to avoid the ability to do both. It's just that someone who has very weak upper back connection is going to need more of that first before you start exploring what should happen when they're out of socket. So teaching them to be stronger in socket and then teaching them to move out of socket. So yeah, I would be prioritizing that strength, but I wouldn't be wary to introduce her to the ability to go in and out of socket. And for her, that would probably be more of assessing her passive hanging ability. So if she can't hang,
Yeah, we've not been able to hang for about 5-6 months because of COVID. But yeah, we did used to in the gym.
yeah. So I would be looking at that shoulders, setting the shoulder strength in the scaps, like having it set properly. But then also looking at developing her strength through hanging out of socket. So then you're actually working on her developing strength out of socket, strength in socket to rotate, and then you can start moving towards that strength movement outside of out of socket kind of position. Francis finds cars very useful. And I guess cars is just kind of like also think about just moving your joints. I mean, it's a very practical, like thought of way of moving the joints and doing joint circles. But it's a very intensive kind of movement that's focusing on rotation. So we can think about CARS, that stands for controlled articulated rotations. And it's also, I guess you could just think about it as joint mobilizations with way more intent. So the difference between me just standing here and doing shoulder circles like this versus, okay, now I'm trying to not move my torso and just make my shoulder do the work. And I'm trying to move through as much range of motion as possible. It's the intent of the rotations and the mobilizations of the joints, positioning of the body, trying to make and isolate the joint that we want to work rather than like whole body kind of movements. I have to do it, like I do tend to do it more on my left side. I've had issues on my left side. And if I were to just do a shoulder circle on my left side versus CARS, you would see that my shoulder circles, I'm moving my torso around my limitation. Whereas when I'm doing CARS, it's like, it's a lot harder, and I'm being very specific to the shoulder joint and what's happening. You're articulating the rotation. So yeah, it's something to look up. It hasn't been a focus point in the lessons that I've provided, but it is a good warm-up strategy. It's like well thought of rotations, well thought of joint rotations. And that comes from FRC. They've really popularized that approach to it. Functional range conditioning. Yeah. So did you guys have any questions about this lesson now that we've gone through it? And maybe you've gone through it already on your own that you wanted me to maybe go deeper on, or maybe experiences you've had. How do you use them? How do I use them? Like I've presented that with within the lesson, but I mean, there's always other ways.
I think you've already answered this, and I probably missed it. So these two exercises, would you go straight into it cold, or would you, for example, do a couch stretch first and then do the pikes? Or
we're not super at risk with like doing these ones cold, but are we going to be in a better end range if we're warmed up? Yeah, like I probably would. Right. So, I don't think there's anything wrong with doing these cold. It just depends on the end range and the ability of the person.
I literally just tried it and my camera off, and I cramped one of my quads. Yeah, that's the reason why I'm asking. Like, I've trained this morning, but I don't know, it just cramped.
Yeah, and a lot of these positions, like the active knee flexion drill, there's often really bad cramps that go on there. So the cramping, that would be probably the only thing you'd be wary of, is get your body warmed up so you don't cramp. But oftentimes too, if you train the end range activations really well, yeah, you'll still cramp even when you're warmed up. You'll still get cramped up, and yeah. So yeah, it's something to experiment with. Cramping sometimes is also telling you that you've gone too far too soon. So you got to back off, find like
Exciting.
Yeah. So it is a good warm up strategy to use these end range agonist activations, but just start. Like if I know I can get my hand to my shin and do a pike lift, I'm probably going to start by my thigh and then like slowly work my way towards my shin. Right. So I just think about how you would break that down and to turn it into progressive overload within a set or in a couple sets. For sure. But I actually do use them for warm-ups a lot. So when my typical warm-up, if I'm like doing some circulation work, doing some sleds or the air bike, I will then usually get down for some statics and agonist activations. It's like my go-to warm-up, hanging. So Francis, are you talking about the one that we did last week? Not sure if you can talk or not. Yeah, that's actually go to lesson 1 in range of strength certification, and it's been updated in there. Yeah, no problem. Cool.
And do you know how you just spoke about the sled? If that's something that's not, so what I'm finding as a whole is like it's not accessible for me at the moment. Yeah. I'm trying all these different exercises, but without even exercises from the knee ability. I know it's not relevant at the moment, but I don't know, is it going to be less effective or is it going to be more effective, or doesn't it make a difference of not doing the sled push first?
It's just a matter of like best case scenario. Like if I have the sleds and I can use the sleds and have access to the sleds, it's going to be better warm up strength strategy for my knee and my feet. You know, like that's, and we talk about warming up, you don't get the feet stretched out as much as you would pushing a sled, whereas you're just running or riding a bike. You don't get VMO activation like you do on a sled. I guess on a bike, you don't get any, the nice thing too on a sled, you don't get that eccentrically loading feeling either. It's just contract. So you can get that on a bike where you're not eccentrically loading the muscles. It's all contract based, which is like a more ideal way to warm up, especially if you're doing strength work. So yeah, the next best thing for me would be, using a bike. I'm not like a big cardio guy anyway. I'm looking at Luke because he probably does 100 burpees. I'd be like the guy on the side being like doing 20 agonist activations instead. So yeah, I think for depends on the session that you're planning to do. I strength train, so I try to keep everything like ready for that session. I like stretching. I like agonist activations. I like contracted warm-up based warm-ups where I'm not getting a lot of eccentric loading to a point where it's going to like fatigue me. So yeah, the elliptical works well. Yeah. I like athletic skips. Like learning to do an athletic skip is like, Ben does provide that in the real movement content, the assault bike in reverse. Yeah. But an athletic skip is like your A skip. Jax, if she's still listening, she would know a lot about that kind of warm up, but it provides triple flexion, an extension, and it's very athletic based. So Ben does have some lessons on athletic skips. And I think it's the ATG overview course. He did do some skipping tutorials, but yeah, sleds and athletic skips are going to be my go-to, along with my static stretch and my agonist activations. And you could do athletic skips on the spot too. That's what's nice about them, is like A skip, B skip, C skip. Those are the variations of it. They're really effective.
So where do you say I can find a demonstration on that?
I'm pretty sure, let me just check. I'm pretty sure it's in the ATG overview course.
Okay.
Last time I checked, it was there. But if it's not, message me and I'll be able to pull something up for you. Yeah. Do you guys have anything else regarding range of strength specifically that you want to talk about? We can talk about other stuff too. Like the focus is on, yeah, Jax is still listening. But yeah, Jax is a highly competitive pole vault, and she would be doing a lot of athletic skip stuff in her warm up. But if you have any other things that maybe you wanted to address or talk about, or things that you're working on in your training that you want to discuss?
I think one thing that I'd like to discuss is Jackson's. I feel like I just want to stretch more.
Yeah.
You know, especially because it's like my intensity is increasing, and I don't know if I just need to just relax. I just always like the feeling afterwards.
Yeah. Like you are also learning so many of the variables of flexibility that no one knows. So it's like, it does become, you can do it all the time. You can be more aggressive with isometric, contract, relax work at one time, and you can be more passive, static, passive, active at another time. You know, you're learning the right fundamentals that you are able to now do it a lot more often. So, I mean, I would imagine you're doing some static stretches and some agonist activations in your warm-ups. Did you hear me?
Sorry, my connection is not the greatest.
Okay.
My video could be better. Let's try it again. Repeat, please.
So I know one thing that you and I have talked about, Jax, is that you're stretching more in your warm-ups.
Yeah, a lot more dynamic stretching, I would say, not really static.
Are you using agonist activations?
I think it's based on how I feel. Like if I feel like if I need it just to get a little extra, then I will. Because sometimes even that dynamic movement won't really work if, let's say, my calf is tight or my hamstring is turned on for some odd reason or something's flared up. Then I'll sit there and I'll take I'll do a little circuit and get the right muscles firing when they need to fire, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely.
So it's kind of more of a feel, not really like I have a real science behind it. I'm like, how do I feel today? Okay, I need this.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's a good way to do it.
Is it the right way? I don't know. All I know is I can run.
Have you gotten into this lesson or the agonist activations?
I have, but sometimes I go too far into them. And so I have to take my time and then go back. It's like I'll breeze through them and then I'll go back just because I'm so eager to try some of them. Yeah. And so if I have an isometric hold or if I have something, I know if I sit in a split, not a straight legged for your hip flexor liftoffs, but if I do that V, my hip flexors will cramp. Trying to find the range that I need to work on. Yep. Not just, let me just do this to do it. Where are my limitations, and spending more time asking those questions.
Yeah. And knowing with knowing with the prescription that there's options, it doesn't always have to be a hold. I think that's kind of the thing with the agonist activations is a lot of times people will just go right to the hold. But if they're always cramping, I would be telling you to just work on light pulses. So getting in that range and just lightly activate like work on that pulsing kind of concept, building up the capacity.
I
to
like
start.
that. I forgot.
Yeah.
Forgot
Usually
about that.
people, when people do the agonist activation work, they go right to holding. But we have options. So if you were to back off the stretch and do more of like a pulse dynamic kind of action to it as even a warm up before you got into the hold, that would be what I would be recommending and suggesting specifically for your warm ups, just getting that dynamic end range movement going.
No, it's a good one.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I feel like there's so much. Like I struggle to, all right, pick like 3 to 4 and then only do those. Not everything you've learned.
Yeah. And yours is just really subjective to the functionality of what you're about to get into. That's the way to really build your session that way. Like, okay, what movements am I getting into? You're getting into a lot of triple extension, running and jumping. So you got to think about your hips and your calves, your tibs. I would be activating the glutes. That would be a huge focus point.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So James is sharing.
What are some good sled warm-ups? Oh, yeah. You can do James.
Yeah, my favorite sled warm-up is just backwards shuffle is my favorite one. The forward push is more strength. Like if I'm going to be doing forward push work, it does get you breathing and doing more range work. But if I'm going to be doing sled work on a regular, I prefer to do reverse sled work. It's high. You can do high frequency reverse sled work. It's actually a great component of recovery. And I'm sure that's something you've been experimenting with. You've been doing a lot of sled work,
Yeah,
Jax.
I was just, yeah, especially if my foot starts to flare up or if my calf, just for recovery. But sometimes it's like nice when someone's like, yeah, you should do this for like 20 seconds on, 30 seconds off. Or sometimes I might overdo it or underdo it. Who knows? It's just another feel thing I do. Kind of judge the body.
I do like doing for repetitive, like reverse sled work isn't going, especially if you have foot issues, it's not going to stretch out the plantar fascia as much. And so it's going to be more specific to healing the knee and getting the VMO pumped up. But I do like doing reverse sled 100 meters without stopping, like just on a regular basis. If I'm going to be doing sled work for recovery, just 100 meters without stopping is a good amount to get the blood flowing and getting the recovery kind of synced up.
Yeah, I'll try those again. I kind of stopped at like 30 because I would just go forward and backwards, really focusing more on pushing it forward to really stretch out the foot. But trying to transition more of the recovery focus, taking out the forward push because I'm already doing so much forward.
Yeah,
and factoring in those longer distances.
For sure. Again. I would be doing a lot of backward sled work, reverse sled work, and with given your workload. Just do 100 meters reverse with a weight that you feel like you can complete 100 meters without stopping.
That'll be a fun challenge. Again, I'm in.
James, you're talking about, I'm not sure.
Benno was asking me about the elliptical and if you use it with higher resistance or higher load. So the gym I'm training at the moment, our AstroTurf area to use the sled is very minimal. It's possibly 10, maybe 15 meters at best. And it's right next to the exercise bikes and the stretching area. So it's always compromised. It's very hard to utilize. But I've always done some form of warm up on an elliptical just so that I could get, the blood flowing in the body before I start exercising. And I wanted to have a play with it to see if I could work that into getting some form of result that I would get from a sled. And I found that putting it into reverse, at least with our style of ellipticals they have like a minimal height difference in the motion. So some of them, they're almost like a stepper, but ours are very minimal. So I'm able to get a similar to close to floor foot motion that I would in a sled. And what I do is I put it into reverse. I hold the set handles, which are in the middle, and I lean back so my arms are extended and bend at the hips and the knees. So that way it's giving me a pulling motion. But as you move your feet from the front of the guards to the rear of the guards, you get different activations. So you can activate more of the soleus, or you get more coming into the VMO.
Nice.
So it just, moving that foot placement changes where you get the resistance, and playing with that during my warm up, I find I get a lot more blood to the area.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Yeah. And Ben likes the reverse treadmill. I actually, when I first got into Ben's stuff, I went out and got an old crappy treadmill. So I have this old crappy treadmill now that I never power on, but I go and just walk on in reverse. And it's good because it's old and crappy. So it's really hard to push the belt. It's like I'd rather the belt get slower and slower because it gets better and better for the reverse walk. But that's another way. Yeah, there's always someone out there trying to get rid of a broken treadmill. We're probably the only ones in the world that are like looking for broken, busted treadmills so we can reverse walk. But yeah, making use of everything. Yeah, so I would keep using the spin bike because there's no eccentric loading in it. It's really nice for that. I've always liked the spin bikes for that. And I would look at the athletic skipping. I was just looking at the course, and I was just trying to find. It's changed a little bit. Like if you go to the anti-gravity component of the old ATG course that Ben originally put on there, he talks about skipping. Oh, it's in the lower body exercise selection. He has a little video on skipping there. Yeah, athletic skips, yep. Cool. I think that's good for tonight, guys. Thanks for jumping on. Reach out to me if anything pops up after the lesson. Reach out to me if you're integrating this stuff for the first time and you want to share what you learned integrating it, or you want some feedback before you go do it. I'm always down to, discuss and share, best ways to do it or learnings. I love hearing your learnings, like what you experienced showing someone or, that kind of stuff. So, yeah. Next week, I will talk about loading range, loading flexibility. So we'll get into the upper and lower discussion. And I got off the phone with James, the old-time strongman guy this morning. He's going to do the next week with me and talk about lateral strength. We're actually going to add that as a new lesson. Yeah, it's going to be cool. That's going to be a new lesson in the certification itself, actually. It's going to be paired in there with loaded range. So it'll be loaded range as one lesson for upper lower. And then this lesson we're going to do with James is going to talk about lateral strength, because I would say I've trained lateral strength when I think about my flexibility, like when I think about side bending and things like that, but he is on another level when he addresses lateral strength. Like he addresses it as a max strength endeavor, which is pretty cool because you think about like I've basically done side bends and he's like, you should be able to max out your side bend. And I'm like, you're nuts. But the guy's like, he's saved a lot of people. Like he's helped a lot of people with sciatica and back pain by getting crazy strong on lateral strength. So that includes lateral pressing, like, rotating presses and stuff like that. So I think that's an important lesson that we should integrate into range of strength. And I think that's something that no one's doing right now that you guys would, if you dug into that lesson and got like a really good feel for it, you'd be doing stuff that no one's doing right now with your clients and your own training. So that should be pretty cool. yeah, we'll do loaded range next week. We'll bring that together as a whole, and then we'll do lateral range, lateral strength with James, and yeah, that'll be sweet. All right. Thanks for jumping on, everyone.